Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Matt Willard, and I'm the Senior Marketing Manager at Fluence Analytics. Before we start the webinar, please note the Q&A and chat features at the bottom of your screens. You can use these to pose questions or make comments during the webinar, and Alex will respond to them at the end. Fluence Analytics is a startup headquartered in New Orleans, Louisiana, that spun out of Tulane University in 2013. We provide analytical products which yield continuous data streams for industrial and lab applications. Today's webinar will explore some of the benefits from the real-time monitoring of polymerization reactions with ACOMP. The webinar will include a brief introduction to ACOMP, followed by a few case studies exhibiting cycle time optimization, process control, and dynamic online measurements in various specialty polymer applications. Our panelist is Alex Reid, CEO and co-founder of Fluence Analytics. As CEO, Alex works with customers, team members, and other stakeholders to develop and execute the strategic vision of the company. And at this time, I will turn the webinar over to Mr. Reid.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Matt, and thank you all for joining our webinar. I'm very excited to be talking to you today about optimizing polymer manufacturing using our ACOMP technology. Quick overview of what we'll be covering today. So first, I'll go into an introduction of ACOMP. Then I'll do a review of applications, specifically where we've installed our systems, where we have data that shows benefits, as Matt described in the introduction. Next, I'll do a little overview on Lab ACOMP, again, highlighting some applications and benefits. And finally, I'll do a quick overview of how we work with companies, so how you would work with Fluence Analytics to assess an application, for example. So we're very excited to be looking at transforming businesses with real-time analytics. As you can see, we've identified 4 quadrants, mainly cost, quality, health, safety and environment, and efficiency, where we can impact production. So we're looking at reducing costs and market share, improving product quality, and then streamlining processes. One of the big issues that we've identified is an inefficiency in analytics. So currently, a big part of the industry is still relying on offline sampling and measurements. So an operator typically will grab a sample, go to a QC lab, and you will get a data point typically delayed by 30 minutes, an hour, maybe 2 hours, and you have information either at the end of a batch or as you're producing continuously, periodically throughout production. So this data is then used to try to drive control, and this is where you see some inefficiency in reaction control because of old data. And the cost of that inefficiency, we've broken down in several areas. So one, you might see off-spec, where you'd have batch loss, or maybe just off-spec material that you need to rework. You may want to not transition as frequently, so you build up inventory to avoid the known off-spec you're going to create. We've seen instances where there's plant-to-plant variability. So in a plant network, you might have different types of spec shipping for the same product, and then you have some customer issues if they're not processing the material properly down the line. And then obviously this inefficiency, you see slow, ineffective scale-up. And on the control side, you might see process upsets, but they would be too late. So what we've done is we've installed ACOMP, which is actually, it stands for Automatic Continuous Online Monitoring of Polymerization Reactions. And this is a fully integrated hardware-software system comprised of sampling, detectors, sensors, and automation. And we're collecting raw data continuously throughout a reaction. We're doing sophisticated analyses to derive critical properties during production and sending that information into a control room. So now what we have is what we call human in the loop, where an operator is using ACOMP data in real time continuously to optimize production by changing feedstocks or adjusting other parameters, for example. A quick review of ACOMP. So in this system, this integrated hardware software system I described on the previous slide, we have a complex series of pumps, fluidics, mixing chambers, and then our detector train and sensors. So it's a fully autonomous platform that is continuously extracting reactor material at typically very low extraction rates, 0.05 to 2 milliliters per minute, and occasionally sometimes higher depending on the application. And then we dilute with a solvent. Sometimes it's a process solvent, other times it's a new solvent. And with our standard detector train and our analyses, we get real-time information on the molecular weight of the material, the intrinsic viscosity of the material, the composition, the conversion, residual monomers, and then obviously because you have this real-time trend, seeing detection of any process anomalies. This is an overview of our ACOMP product as it stands today. So we have detectors, sensors. As we saw before, there's multiple configurations available. The software, which is on board, does all of the analysis. We also have additional toolkits that can provide data outputs to databases where needed. And then we have a very sophisticated HMI and automation platform as well. And then as needed, we do classification depending on the environment, whether it's industrial or lab. And we have other types of options available. And so what we see, and this is particularly important, is this idea of contextualization. So obviously, there's a lot of information already being gathered from the process. So we have temperatures, pressures, feed rates, flow rates, all that kind of information being captured in a control system and typically being stored in a process historian. Then you have all your lab data, and then you have your inventory, raw material information. So all this is already being captured, and there's already a lot of effort being used or being applied to try to optimize production using that type of information. And so what we see with ACOMP is a new way to contextualize that data. So we have the opportunity to have your existing process data, your existing control systems that now have real-time information on the product while you're manufacturing it to drive even more advanced correlation and control. And here's just a very high-level example, and then we'll be showing data later on of how this would work. So say you have a temperature, pressure, these curves would be in a process, maybe it's a batch, maybe it's continuous. And then you have your lab data, which again is delayed by 1 or 2 hours. So you're getting your data here, but maybe it was collected here. And now with ACOMP, you would have continuous data overlaid and able to provide context to your process data. And then you could even correlate to lab data. So you have a lot more information now, again, to detect things like these process disruptions in real time. So that's just the high-level overview of how we would use that context. So what we've seen with our ACOMP system is that, for example, maybe in a batch or semi-batch process, a plant making $50 million a year in sales, just a small impact in cycle time can have a significant impact in benefit. So say you're trying to get an endpoint analysis and you're trying to see where you are to reduce your cycle time, it could be worth a lot of money. And then looking at additional benefits like product consistency, energy savings, reducing manual sampling, you could derive additional benefits. So this would be one example in a batch or semi-batch. In continuous processing, obviously you might have a higher output, and in this case you might have a significant impact by reducing your off-spec material, either from transitions or steady state deviations, and then you could have additional benefits from process control, tighter specifications, less manual sampling. So to highlight some of these benefits, I'd like to show our first industrial case study, which was with polyacrylamide. This is a free radical polymerization in a batch reactor. You can see that we had a little publication in Chemical Processing. You can see the results in the September 2018 issue. This was done with Nalco. And then you can see this is just a high-level view of what we did in that project. So if you were to actually grab sample periodically, this would be your endpoint specification. So maybe every hour you pulled a sample, this is what you'd be tracking. And then you have a performance specification that you'd like to meet as well. So again, every hour you might be seeing this. So the curves are actually ACOMP data continuously tracking and predicting that endpoint in real time, and also monitoring your performance specification for your quality. So you see that in this case, with that dynamic endpoint analysis that ACOMP provides, we're able to predict and see when a reaction should be completed versus maybe the standard recipe. So most companies would operate under a standard recipe, run that full amount of time, and then stop. So in this case, you might see variability batch to batch, even same day, different feedstocks. So it is actually more valuable to have a dynamic analysis of that endpoint and know exactly when you're done so you can stop and start your next batch. And that benefit, as you can see in this case, was over an hour. So that's a significant impact on the full reaction. And you can see that perhaps over-processing the product does impact your performance specification. So you might have an issue with quality if you continue to process on your set recipe. So this was, an interesting finding that we saw. And again, to highlight what that means is, so over time, you could save, in this case, maybe 15 to 20% of your reaction time by having this dynamic endpoint analysis. And then you may also impact your quality by being able to know exactly when you're done and stopping your batch in time. Next, we have a study we did on condensation polymers. So this was, again, a batch process that we did at pilot scale. So step growth polymerization. And so we have, in this case, two ACOMP signals we're looking at. This red one is the refractive index. And as you can see, it's very sensitive to the start of the reaction. So you can immediately see when you've started your reaction and track it over time. Eventually, it does level off because of the sensitivity to the oligomer formation. And then you can see over time, the reduced viscosity, which is an indicator of molecular weight, is not sensitive in the beginning of the reaction. Then all of a sudden, you start to see your reaction take off very quickly as you're making higher molecular weight. So in this instance, it would be a similar value proposition. Your benefit would be that you would know when to stop your reaction exactly when you hit your desired specification range, which today, again, you would have to do on a set recipe, see what you made at the end. You might hit the spec, you might be on the low end of the spec, you might be on the high end of the spec. So in this case, by monitoring it, you would know exactly when to stop and have your be on target. You might even be able to tighten specifications to differentiate from your competition or minimize off-spec and optimize your kinetics. So significant benefits by being able to monitor and control your quality parameter. The other thing we saw was being able to understand and see differences between reactions. So at this case, it was the same chemistry, and now we're looking at it from a kinetic perspective. So how are these reactions different? And we can actually see variations. In theory, we ran the exact same thing the same way, but we see here that it was very different results in the time, the kinetics of the process. So again, you would have an opportunity with monitoring to do either real-time troubleshooting and understand, oh, wow, we're not on the kinetic pathway we wanted, or do post-batch troubleshooting and say, well, how do we get the kinetic pathway we want now that we've seen X number of reactions and we have this data we can mine? So either way, you would have the opportunity with this monitoring to control and optimize your kinetics in addition to the last slide, which would be optimizing your quality. So then you can have a fully optimized reaction for both speed and quality. And finally, in some of these processes, and it's not unique to this type of chemistry, you might have an issue where you'd have a gelation event, which can create problems in your reactor and obviously would impact your end product quality. So what we see is that our ACOMP data is very sensitive to gelation events. So you could see where it starts to spike up. Those were gelation events, and it was an early indicator. So you could actually even potentially predict that gelation, maybe prevent it. So that would be another benefit, would be prevent a total batch failure rather than just maybe off-spec material you'd have to rework. So again, pretty significant there. Next, we have a case study where we looked at a couple adhesive chemistries. So this is either semi-batch or batch reactions. So in this first one, it was we were actually looking at different recipes of a similar chemistry and trying to assess how much changing one of the materials, in this case acrylic acid, affected both the molecular weight, meaning the end product property, and also the kinetics of each reaction. So in this case, you would see that all these different reactions had very different kinetic pathways. So again, you have longer time scales here, you have different molecular weights as detected by light scattering. So it's very interesting to see that even a very small change, in this case it was an 8% by weight difference, impacted in the process. So this would be very useful for, again, looking at batch-to-batch variability, or if you're trying to design a new type of product, how to control those properties and kinetics. In this case, we're looking at a polyurethane reaction. This was a isophorone diisocyanate with ethylene glycol, and we did it both in batch and then semi-batch, where we actually changed the feeds of it. And the key thing we wanted to show here was that, one, we were able to monitor this type of chemistry, and two, you can see where different parts of the process are impacted by changing your feed rates. So you could see here it increased the rate, and then here when we stopped flow it started to level off. So again, showing the power of that data and that information as a control and optimization tool. So looking at continuous processes, we did some work a long time ago assessing whether or not our ACOMP detectors could add value to an EPDM process. This was done several years ago. And what we were basically just trying to do was a proof of concept to say, if we had, in this case, we just looked at the intrinsic viscosity measurement, which is a molecular weight dependent measurement, could we correlate to one of their key lab parameters, in this case, Mooney? And so here you can see offline, these were all offline results with our detectors, that yes, we could track and see a correlation with their Mooney viscosity, which is a measurement that is done offline maybe every hour or 2 hours in production. And this was just with one ACOMP detector. So what we have now is a full suite of detectors, so you can actually use multiple parameters to build an even stronger correlation to this lab information. And so the benefit here is that transition time. So while you're waiting, while you're going from one grade to another, or coming up to a grade, depending on how you do transitions, you know when you actually are tracking based on the process. So the ACOMP data is only maybe 5-10 minutes behind, depending on the dilution factors, but you're getting it continuously. And if you factor in the reactor dynamics, you can actually get almost near real-time information and control, whereas in this case, you're waiting every hour for delay of data. And so what that means is you would actually know at every second where you are and start to drive your control strategy to get on spec faster. Whereas if you're relying on this offline information, you might have to wait several hours before each process change. And so the benefit, again, as we said earlier, is to be able to minimize that off-spec material, as we see up here, from the shorter grade transitions. And then obviously, once you're on steady state and you're making the product you want continuously, so here you would say, okay, we're right dialed in, we're in the middle of our specification. If you start to see any deviation up or down, you would actually be able to see it pretty quickly and control it before you create a multi-hour off-spec event. So what we see here is significant value in real-time information, again, correlating it to process data, correlating it to lab data, and being able to optimize the production process. This one is one we'll have installed in 2019. So we are doing SSBR batch optimization. So check back with us. This is coming soon. We'll have details on it. We've done some lab tests, and we will be able to share information on how we've optimized both quality and cycle time in this type of a process next year. So on the lab ACOMP side, we just spent time showing how that information would be good for, how ACOMP data would be good for control and optimization of a running process. So here, what we're particularly interested in is looking at the lab or pilot scale and seeing how we can use this data to maybe optimize or develop a new product much faster. So here we have a case study where we did, it was a polyacrylamide, and we did 3 different ACOMP runs, and we're looking at the molecular weight and the conversion for these batch reactions. And what we changed was the initiator. So we used 3 different amounts, 3 different concentrations of initiator. So as you can see, the lower initiator, you came down and you had a higher molecular weight and a slower conversion path. And then on the other ones, you would actually react faster and have a different molecular weight. And so what we could do here is optimize both for your quality, so your molecular weight, and your speed, so the kinetics, based on these ACOMP runs. So you may find your sweet spot is like, I want to make it in this amount of time and I want it to have this type of property. And you can instantly visualize this. You run 3 reactions, you have a very rich data set to assess how to get there. And we think that comparable information using offline measurements would require many more experiments than we've done here. For example, we regularly in the past and still occasionally will cross-check our data with GPC. So these were aliquots pulled through the reaction. So each of these needs to be analyzed through GPC and correlated to the ACOMP data, whereas we're getting this information continuously. So you can imagine how long that would take to actually run these reactions, do the offline testing, run more reactions, do more offline testing, and you're still lagging because you don't have the detail and the granularity that you would see with ACOMP. So this was another interesting case where we were looking to do a trimodal composition distribution, yet we wanted to maintain an almost constant molecular weight. And this was an experiment where we were actually using ACOMP in the lab to drive that composition and maintain the molecular weight by actually looking at ACOMP data and adjusting feed rates of the monomer. So this was a semi-batch type of a process. And you can see the publication here. So we did the feed flow rates and the 2 monomers. And again, in order to get this type of a measurement, we think it would be almost impossible to control the molecular weight and the composition at the same time without ACOMP. So again, you'd have to run a lot of reactions to potentially understand and pull a lot of aliquots to do offline testing to get a very similar understanding of what we've been able to achieve in this result with ACOMP. So, and this was a one-shot experiment. Did it all in one go, controlled it, saw where we needed to go, and ended up with the distribution we wanted and the molecular weight we wanted. And next, we see how that last experiment is a good segue to this, where we were actually looking at how do we actively control reactions. So this goes to the heart of where the value is with ACOMP. So in this case, here's a typical, maybe a batch or semi-batch reactor where you'd have different knobs that you can turn to impact the quality that's being, or the material that's being produced in this reactor. So if it's free radical, maybe you have oxygen to slow down or kill the reaction. Semi-batch, you might change your monomer composition or feeds, initiator feeds, chain transfer. You have a jacket, you might heat or cool or mix, adjust your impeller speed. So these are things that you can adjust. And this is your standard ACOMP. And then we wrote an automated controller that was actually looking at the ACOMP information and then adjusting parameters to drive for specific properties. So these were some of the early experiments where we were doing it with active manual control, where we actually were looking at ACOMP and it was telling us set points and then we would adjust the feeds directly. And so we had pretty broad bands that we were trying to target, and we did pretty well maintaining them in the middle. for both the conversion and molecular weight. Next, we actually did the automated controller, and here you would see in a free radical polymerization of polyacrylamide how your molecular weight comes down normal over time. This is a standard uncontrolled reaction where you'd come down. So in order to highlight the power of this control tool and of ACOMP, we actually decided, well, let's program it to drive the molecular weight up. So what it was doing was it was taking ACOMP measurements continuously and then adjusting the flow of the monomer into the reactor to drive the molecular weight up over time and do it within a pretty controlled path. And so we were very excited to see this result and have since done a lot more work. But this was all done at pilot scale, and we think that the power of combining this with process data is really the next step, where you already have some control models in place, maybe not, but you do have a lot more information and more variables at play, and we have a lot more tools and information coming from ACOMP. So then you can build control and modeling algorithms that will take that information and continuously adjust the reactor to drive the properties that you want. And so this is where we would see the biggest benefit over time. And so this is where we are today. So as you've seen, we've done batch, semi-batch, continuous reactors. We've done solution, done bulk phase, emulsion, inverse emulsion. Here are some of the monomer classes that we've worked in terms of chemistries. And here are some that we're working on that we hope to have launched soon. SBR, as I mentioned before, will be launched next year. And then we have several others that we're working on with different customers. And so to recap, at level one, the benefits we really see are with new information, new monitoring, and human-in-the-loop control. You could potentially free up capacity, so cycle time, for example, mitigate your process upsets, improve your yield, and reduce or eliminate lab analytics over time. So this would be the first step where with ACOMP you would have some value. The next step is, okay, now you have all this information, driving tighter specifications, improving quality, and gaining greater consistency is where we see a very solid next level of value. And then finally, looking at how do we differentiate, using ACOMP to develop new products and drive more sophisticated control with different materials with different properties. This is where you could create the most value with long-term ACOMP data and control. So here's just an example of how we work with companies. Recently, towards the end of last year, this year, we launched the proof of concept program. So now we are able to work with companies to validate ACOMP in a specific chemistry. So we actually will bring an ACOMP system and we'll have personnel on site. And this is a short-term paid trial that is creditable towards the platform as a service or purchase of the system. Where we can actually go and collect several weeks of data and highlight what the value is in that application. Is it, how do we optimize production, increase yield? We can actually see all that directly by looking at data with the customer. At the next phase, we would have platform as a service. So as you saw here, this is where we actually have a subscription for ACOMP, which would include the system. Also includes service and software upgrades, which are tailored to each client. And this we actually have not officially launched. We're launching now and in discussions with several customers about this program. And then finally, what we've been doing to date has been the purchase of a system. So you can purchase an ACOMP. We do have annual service agreements and then reports, data analytics, and consulting services on top of that. So these are the three ways we can work with companies and assess applications to see where ACOMP can add value to production. So in closing, I hope that the big takeaway is that we have a way to generate new real-time information on properties and kinetics of production. And with that, we see tremendous opportunities, not just today in monitoring and doing manual control, but eventually doing closed loop control and developing new materials. So for us, we see this as a big opportunity in manufacturing, but also in lab and pilot scale. So hopefully that was enough information as an overview of where we see the value of this new data. And with that, I think we'll open up for questions. And if you haven't used it, go ahead and use the Q&A function. Submit questions.
Thank you, Alex. We do have a couple of questions already. If you do have a question you want to ask, just use the Q&A or chat feature located at the bottom of your screen. The first question is, why would you want the molecular weight to go against its natural order? For the control slide.
This slide, okay. Yeah, so in this case, you don't necessarily want that, but maybe you do if you're trying to drive a property. The reason we did it was because it would create a very easy to see representation of the power of that control algorithm. So not that you necessarily want it, but it's something that is capable. So if you did want to drive maybe a molecular weight that came to here, for example, that you could. So the point was targeting and control.
Okay. Thank you. The next question, what kind of potential savings can ACOMP help generate for a customer?
So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, really what we're looking at is savings related to cycle time, savings related to reduction in off-spec material, and these are things that would significantly impact production. So what we've seen is that the potential for savings is anywhere from $500,000 to several $1,000,000 a year in payback, depending on the type of application and the type of benefit impacted. So again, cycle time, quality are the biggest ones that we can yield, and quite significant benefits that we've seen.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Alex. That's all the questions we have at this point. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I will send out these slides and a recording of the webinar in a day or two. And please get in contact with us if you have any questions or interest in working with ACOMP, or just you want more information. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.